Welcome to MySecurityTV. My name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor and Director for MySecurity Media. We have a very special episode with Dr. Chris Flaherty here in Sydney with me. And we're going to be talking about, well, here's the title, The War Laser, New Terrestrial Surface Battlefield Geometry, based on a new paper from Chris. Chris, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. It's a real pleasure to be here right now.
Great. And I didn't know you were in Sydney. We last caught up, it would have been around 2012, and let me at least introduce you to the audience. I've got your brief bio up here. Let me bring it up. Dr. Chris Flaherty, he was first sort of came to prominence, certainly in my mind, the author of the Terrorism Research Centre's report, Dangerous Minds, 2012. He was the co-primary author, along with Robert Bunker, of the book Body Cavity Bombers, The New Martyrs, 2013. And then recently contributed a book chapter, The Role of CCTV in Terrorism TTPs. And that's edited by Dave Deleck, Robert Bunker and John Sullivan and Almar Kershavas. And David Kilcullen, I think, wrote some script into that book as well, I think the preface. And that book is Blood and Concrete, 21st Century Conflict in Urban Centres and Mega Cities. Chris, you've got a very interesting background. You're practically a security researcher in that context, it looks. The War Laser, New Terrestrial Surface Battlefield Geometry. Let me sort of introduce the audience what we're going to be talking about. And let me just bring up a figure here. We're looking at figure 1. We've got T1, T2, T3, which are the targets. Yeah. And then WT and W1, which would be the weapons. And this is kind of how the laser structure works. Maybe talk us through the motivation for the paper, and then we'll obviously have the link in the show notes and get them talking about it. But we're effectively talking about modern warfare, yeah?
That's correct, Chris. The motivation for the article is it's something that's been in my mind for the last 2 years. A number of my colleagues have been working on this I was recently, this morning, reviewing an article that was back in 1999, yeah, looking at laser weapons, basically small arms. What I've noticed in the last year or so, one of the great ironies over this whole COVID-19 period, is we're seeing some really dramatic technological shifts occurring within society. And one of the interesting things is on YouTube, we have lots of awesome dudes, and they be applauded because they're really beginning to think about how this technology works. But it also began to emphasize in my mind a huge generational change that's occurring. And the War Laser article was looking at the current a snapshot of the current literature on laser weapons, focusing not so much on the actual proprietary technology, which most of these articles really are dedicated to, but more broader questions about, does this actually affect tactics, conventional tactics, in any particular way? And the more you begin to pull out of these articles the key characteristics or weapons characteristics of lasers, you begin to realize there is actually some difference between how we would normally think about conventional kinetic weapons. And when we talk about conventional kinetic weapon, I'm talking about an ordinary rifle or an artillery piece and so forth, as opposed to a laser being used. Now, the other important point is that we've had lasers for a very long time. We have an almost century of science fiction in terms of the use of the laser. We have the burning mirrors from the 7th century AD in Byzantium. So there's a well-established knowledge about how these weapons potentially could work. Interestingly enough, similar themes keep turning up all the time. Right. And it's a similar, and hence when we start talking about the battlefield geometry, and I do apologize, it's a bit of a mouthful of an article title, but it is talking about the fact is when you think about a battlefield as having a particular geometry in terms of its structure. Yep. And what this first diagram is looking at is this taking a section of the Earth's surface, acknowledging it's a curving. We sit on a planet, and lasers fire in near direct lines. They do. There is a beam divergence, but basically it's a near straight trajectory for all arguments, for all intents and purposes. So one of these start to talk about the limitations of lasers. But the interesting thing about lasers is, as a weapon, it actually has the same beam has a gradiated effect depending on how far it travels. So in the immediate vicinity of the laser, it will burn through. Beyond that, it dazzles, it blinds and then dazzles. And I think that basic dynamic, or what we generally would refer to as a deep penetration, a type of enfilade tactic, if people are familiar with that expression. Enfilade meaning to fire through one target after another, classically used in warfare. We begin to see a quite different dynamic play out, and that actually raises some really interesting questions. If there is a growing move towards a viability of laser weapons, and for up to now, we actually have had a bit of a failed asparagus field when it comes to lasers and using laser weapons, going back to the Star Wars initiative during the Reagan administration period, and now to currently. But we are seeing in this year alone the deployment of lasers on a number of US frigates. We're seeing Striker vehicles being converted to carry battlefield lasers and the setup of a battalion. The Russians themselves have a very large laser vehicle, which is mobile but largely dedicated to dazzling satellites overhead. And a number of other countries are moving in this direction. So essentially, the laser is actually starting to come onto the battlefield.
Yep.
And so it's moving from a niche application, from an experimental application in small numbers to much more general use. And of course, as we know with weapons progression, once these things start to become real and usable, then we begin to see real changes. And in actual fact, interestingly enough, this is where the awesome dudes on YouTube begin to come into play, because we're looking at young engineers actually pulling back engineering, repurposing, actually trying to build laser pistols and laser guns. Why? Because it's driven by science fiction culture. And that science fiction culture is absolutely significant. One of the interesting points we made in the Body Cavity Bomber book is that at one point, the principal author, Robert Bunker, was actually, we documented this in the book, he was actually barred from talking about it because of fear of, well, if you let people know about it, they might start thinking about it. A bit like an abstinence argument.
Yeah.
But the reality was, is I could cite over 30 years of science fiction going back to the 1960s, where actual fact they talked about fantasy concepts of body cavity bombs, but they were actually using a remarkably consistent ways, or actually consistent with how the actual tactics of the body cavity bomb worked. So again, the laser is we have a generation schooled to expect how to use lasers. Their design culture is driving them towards effectively using these weapons, developing these weapons. And at some point, those cultures begin to merge together, and we get a convergence of technology.
And the science is known as well. I'm just going to bring up your next slide. These are figures from the report itself. So you basic power supply and input energy through to that energy conversion, which is, and then you have beam control system, you have the thermal management system, and then the laser device itself, which is that output of the energy.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really, you've kind of summed it up here, that energy conversion, the beam control system, obviously the size of the beam, the strength of that beam, the thermal management system looking at heat control and the like, and then the laser device as well. And again, with that known science, it's just a matter of really getting that input energy about right as well. How dangerous is that, and how readily available are some of these components?
Well, I mean, we've got now in our society widespread application of lasers in an industrial and also medical sense. We also use them for leisure. You can see there's a number of laser pistols are legitimately available on the market for pentathlons as well as laser shoots.
Yeah.
Most modern militaries actually will use laser devices in terms of infantry combat training.
The weaponry, right?
Weaponry. And so one of these laser taggers courses have been a long-standing fun pursuit. The interesting thing is we're moving from these being non-lethal to weapons that potentially actually have an enormous amount of actually what we generally call powerful burning laser, and that converging towards a strong portable laser. And I think rather at its absolute simplest, the laser is simply energy input conversion, energy output. And that has actually pretty profound implications in terms of how we think about tactics. I mean, at the moment, we just take a very straightforward scenario where the US Navy is looking at the use of a laser defense for a frigate. Now, there's about 3 or 4 ships so far that have fitted out. Many of these were actually part of an experimental stage going back to about 2014. But we're now seeing from about 2020 onwards, these will become more mainstream as they begin to fit out more ships. I think in one article I saw about several frigates were planned
And
to take
these, and I take it these are there as defence against. Is it like the hypersonic weapons that have been built as well? I mean,
no, it's actually more immediate than that. The biggest threat posed to a frigate, believe it or not, is actually the small drone and the small speedboat.
Okay.
And it comes out of a mismatch, if you like, with military design and also the sort of wars we envisage to fight have ultimately gone towards the idea of standoff, largely distributed forces, packing an enormous amount of power in terms of the weaponry that they use against each other. What has become a problem with the modern sort of move to, we're largely fighting extremist and terrorist wars, is it's actually the small, slow-moving, or relatively slow-moving speedboat or the drone. Now, for decades now, we've been talking about salvo and swarm warfare. I think earlier you were telling me about one Australian academic you're talking to was talking about firearm warfare.
Yep.
And the problem with these types of warfare is we're not dealing with, when we talk about swarming, true swarming is not 1, 7, or 10 small UAVs. It's 100, or it's 1,000,
yep,
or it's tens of thousands.
Or worse, 100,000.
Exactly, and that's not inconceivable. We could actually see it. I'll pitch this to you as a potential scenario. Let's say, for example, we have a container-sized carrier with numerous chutes, and it's designed to fire a salvo of 20,000 small drones. And they're designed to fly over a frigate and completely swarm it like a pack of flies or whatever you want to call mosquitoes. How do you defend against that?
Yep.
There's a point at which the conventional ammunition you're carrying will be expended.
Well, the same scenario could just be the same, that you could fly these 20,000 drones into a city and spread across a city. I think that scenario is possible even now. It's really the computing power to control those, but you could pretty much take the time to program each of those drones on a predetermined flight path and do that now. I mean, that's conceivable, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and also the fact is it doesn't really. I mean, we tend to talk about quite sophisticated forms of network warfare, but the reality is that we also need to think in terms of the lowest common denominator. You simply just fly these things at something.
Yeah.
It's saying a law of averages, something's going to hit something.
So it really comes down to the intent of that adversary, and obviously in the battlefield, the intent is to kill, right?
Well, exactly. I think it was in World War II, kamikaze warfare.
Yeah.
It wasn't 1 or 2 planes. It was huge numbers of these things being sent up, and just flying constantly in a target. And that's actually, I mean, at one level, the problem with the way we tend to think about theoretical warfare is we can overcomplicate it. When in actual fact, the realities are, is if we just have to look at the most recent conflicts fought this year alone, the sheer brutality and lethality and speed at which weapons and men, people, or equipment and facilities were destroyed is frightening. And I think that even though they were actually, and that's the problem, is that is the sort of war we can envisage, because it's the lowest common denominator in terms of, how do you destroy an opponent? You brute force batter them out the way.
Well, we're in the age of the space-based weapons, the hypersonic weapons, and you've broken this down in the future battle. Will have 3 intermeshing components: the Epicentre Battle, fought on the terrestrial surface, likely to operate strategically on the offensive, but tactically on the defence. Then the second will be space-based war, where hypersonic and space-based weapons are likely to provide strategic weapon strikes. And 3, Peripheral Marauder Battle. The focus of this short overview paper will be the Terrestrial Surface Battlefield, and it's anticipated to be more defensive style of battle. The area, and in the paper, you've definitely covered off the sort of the structure of the weapons and sort of the battle tactics. Where do you see sort of the cybers into this? The compute. I mean, you mentioned sort of artificial intelligence or the machine learning in this. How does that potentially overlay and sort of play a major part in this?
It's more or less as part of a completely integrated battle. I think at this point in time, we tend to think in terms of almost discrete domains. There'll be a cyber warfare domain, there'll be a land warfare domain, and so forth. But most of the general thinking is that now people are beginning to start figuring out how does this actually all integrate into an overall continuous effect. And you're battering away at an opponent in various ways, in various times, in various manner and form. And I think that's so. Essentially, it's the point of this article is to look at one discrete aspect, which is how does the laser begin to change the dynamics of the battlefield. And in that article, I throw up a fairly novel tactical idea, which is the idea of the laser screen.
Yeah, I'm just reading it now, right? Yeah. Talk us through the laser screen. And if I bring up this next image here of the cityscape, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, talk us through this.
Well, the idea behind that is there's been quite a string of articles that have been written about how we're increasingly moving towards heavily urbanized environments. A large part of the planet is expected to be heavily urbanized by a certain point. And you just have to look at a nightscape view of the planet to see how much of it is actually completely lit. And we are seeing huge megacities emerge. One of the arguments I've been making is that we're actually moving towards a unique scenario where we have what I call as the common shared platform, which is that we're plugging into a technological infrastructure that we are all sharing, including we're sharing it with our opponents at the same time as they're sharing it with us. And essentially that begins to change one of the basic ideas we actually have about the operational environment, which is you tend to sort of view, my logistics support from their logistics support is a bit like a solid sidebar on either side of the campaign field. But the reality is I tend to believe most modern conflict forces are thoroughly distributed and interposed throughout each other, into discrete elements, all seeking out friendly and foe. One of the things about the common shared platform is it's about a common shared infrastructure in terms of power, information system, and so forth. I mean, you just have to look at the situation we're bearing with now with the constant brute force attacks in the cyber realm, but we're operating off exactly the same platform, that we actually share a common platform with them, which allows them to access our systems as much as we can fend them off and possibly access theirs. So hensely, what I was arguing there is that if the power component is stripped away from the laser unit, so you just have the converter to the laser beam, it becomes a plug-and-play type of weapon.
Right.
Now, what happens with 3D printing and mass production? You just simply mass produce thousands of these things and plug them everywhere. In an urban environment, classically, there's about 300 meters between buildings. So, and essentially, it's actually bringing us into the realm of probably the current operational, current range of of heavy industrial lasers. And this produces an environment which is completely filled up with lasers, either firing out, either automated fire or whatever. But the argument about the screen, if you like, is it just shows how novel the tactics can actually be when you start looking at the general characteristics of lasers. The most familiar thing is the column of lights. And so you think about that as being how it's almost a science fiction-y idea, because ultimately you have, I was just actually watching Forbidden Planet the other day where they have the laser screen set up, a laser fence, and in fact we're actually seeing laser fencing now used on borders, particularly in India, where they're developing that type of technology. Where the opponent comes through that, and if they survive, then they're attacked with the laser guns or the ray guns. Now, it sounds science fiction-y, but the realities are is they probably actually artistically and aesthetically actually fell onto probably how these things would generally be used anyway. And when you talk about this if you like, the defensive battle, classically in World War I, the Germans fought defensively on a defensive battle, even though they were actually strategically on the fence. They occupied a large chunk of Belgium and France. So the Germans were able to defend long, deep defensive positions well back from forcing the British and the French and the Allies to come over towards them. And they were able to destroy them in the manner of their choosing. And that ultimately reflects also, I think, what's also happening with disaggregated battle is increasingly deep penetration well into any area, forcing the opponent to come to you. That doesn't, and actually, that actually tends to sort of fit in. It's consistent with how lasers generally tend to work, which is one of the other great limitations on lasers is the dwell time.
Right.
A laser needs to actually sit on a spot in order for heat to build up on the surface in order to have an effect.
Yeah.
So, and essentially, now this is an article written in terms of the general characteristics of lasers as they currently present, given the current technology. That doesn't mean it won't change, but I do think it's important for us to start thinking about the implications of this technology and thinking about a common language that we can actually use in order to fit this into a lot of the other tactical and operational concepts that we actually have. So there's a common way of understanding how these weapons will ultimately fit in. Other than that, you're left with a situation of a novel, discrete weapon, which is specifically there to fight a certain niche function, when in actual fact it probably has a lot greater utility than that. And it tends to operate quite differently from a standard kinetic weapon. I mean, one of the interesting points I talk about the laser tag being the future battlefield labs. One of the things I've been wondering about is there a general situation if we're training soldiers using lasers to train in minor infantry tactics? Is there some sort of discrete change in the tactics occurring which we don't realise? And again, it goes back to a generation being schooled in what to expect.
Yep.
So
well, it's a fair question. How much, we talked about it's been around, and starting to get applied increasingly more and more, but it's been around for a couple of decades. And again, my research, you just had a look at what Israel's doing. We've had the Iron Dome out there for some time, and they're now working on other tactics around that. And they're relatively, most of this is being disclosed openly. How much is it likely to change the future battle tactics? The strategy might still stay the same, but with new weapons or new defence capabilities, it will change the tactics, won't it?
It will indeed, because I think one of the interesting things is, let's face it, we've since war has begun, we've used a form of tactics based on arcing shots. A bow, ultimately, gravity affects everything. Right. But with lasers, we're now looking at a type of warfare based on basically line of sight, line of hit.
And if they're in a satellite, then you've got global access as well. It's different from a land-based system.
This article about laser warfare actually sits at the back end of a number of articles I've started to write during this year. This is one of the things when we have long lockdowns with COVID-19. You have to sit down.
There has been a lot of writing this year, correct? Yeah.
Yes, there has been a lot of writing. And these are largely exploratory articles, but the interesting thing is that we're actually seeing in the last couple of years some major, as I said, major technological shifts and application shifts and utility shifts that are occurring, which could actually see, start from the 2021s onward, start to see a different type of battle emerge. And on one level, we're going to have enormous legacy, because one thing I think which is not so much it's confusing to people, they're saying, well, hang about, I'm looking at quite sophisticated militaries with a lot of heavy weaponry, heavy hardware, all brand new and usable. And no one says any of that's going to disappear. But then again, as I think we were talking earlier, just look at photographs from 1900 to 1918, the rapid succession in terms of the appearance of soldiers, how they operated, the sort of ideas they had about how war was to be waged. And I think the problem is one, you get these moments in military history where there are sudden technological shocks, and there is sudden jettisoning of whole equipment systems in favour of a new one, even before they're actually deployed.
And here we are, we're talking about our submarine here in Australia, the submarine program, delivering in 2050. You really just don't understand what the world's going to look like in 2050. But we have to do it anyway. We are locked in. It's a difficult one to play with, but we are in a period of significant change right now, surely.
Well, yeah, we are. But the thing is, there's also the fact is we're designing platforms to plug and play.
Yeah.
They're
modularized, yeah.
We're modular design. I mean, it's actually probably one of the great drivers.
Yeah.
You've got to remember that there are airframes we're using today, which are actually close to 70 or 80 years old. That's actually, the British, the Brown Bess musket existed for 200 years.
Right.
The longbow existed for over 800 years. There are long-standing weapons platforms which actually just keep changing, even though it's basically the same piece of platform.
Got it.
As long as the metal and the plastic lasts, it'll continue to be used.
Yeah.
I think the thing is we could be seeing a sort of situation where you suddenly see these shock uses of weapons on the battlefield. I mean, to give you an example, much of the American Civil War was fought with muzzle-loading weapons, muskets. Along parallel to that, there were lever-action rifles, there were revolvers, there was breech-loading artillery. The Gatling gun made its first appearance in the Civil War. The Civil War finished in 1865. In 1866, a Prussian army armed with a needle rifle destroys within a matter of hours an entire Austrian army armed with muskets. Major technological shift had occurred. Those weapons had been in development for over 2 decades earlier. They simply just ran parallel. The rifled musket was used in parallel to the smoothbore as a specialised weapon. I can well anticipate, probably from the next year onwards, as the awesome dudes begin to develop laser rifles and laser pistols, these begin to see application on the battlefield as a specialised weapon.
Well, I've just brought up your image of the laser, the beam path of the laser gun.
Yeah.
Talk us through that. It's obviously burning through, then blinding, and then dazzling. How lethal can this be, right?
At the current level of technology, quite lethal. I mean, the realities are, one of the surprising, reality is, this may be a bit of a surprise to people, I never know how an article is going to finish when I start writing it.
Yeah, fair enough.
I simply start asking questions.
Yeah.
I don't really have a structure.
My interviews are like that, Chris. So, yeah.
So you always have pleasant surprises,
yeah,
or unpleasant surprises, as the case may be. The most interesting surprise was just the speed at which we're looking at a wide variety of industrial use lasers being stripped down, placed into new housings with 3D design, 3D printing, and turned into laser pistols. Now, my view is when I see a laser pistol that can burn a hole through a balloon at 2 meters, at 5 to 10 or 15 meters blind someone, and at 30 meters possibly, can dazzle them. It illustrates beautifully the unique nature of the laser as a type of weapon, which has these degrading effects. But the other problem, of course, being is it also represents, a major domestic threat, because at what point, even though you can argue, yes, the use of lasers is illegal, one of the most disturbing things you see in modern protests is the amount of green lasers being used to blind and dazzle
Hong Kong. Yeah.
Security. We saw it in Hong Kong, we've seen it in Europe, we saw it in the United States. My issue would be is right now, at what point in the next year or so does people suddenly start thinking, well, firearms are hard to access. What about the laser pistol?
Yep.
Most people are shot within a meter of each other. Most people are executed within a meter of each other. And essentially one of the problems you have to have is that with small arms crimes, at what point does the laser pistol become a more than adequate substitute for a handgun? Because it's just another type of handgun. Now, you can argue that, I think this is where we need to start looking at this technology in a serious way. It's not just a joke, it's actually something which is a real developing phenomenon. And at some point, the technology will actually go to a greater level of usability, utility, but also increasingly people pushing the range of these technologies in terms of, and working out how to. But the interesting thing about it is it's classic sort of fabrications design technique and experimentation technique, is where you're constantly just experimenting and busting things until something falls out the other side, and you do it at a rapid pace. It's a very different sort of design culture, but it's a really successful design culture.
And I think it's also the current culture of the online sharing as well.
Exactly.
So you can do it in groups, and again, that just sort of accelerates that research capability. Well, look, what we'll do, we'll keep the audience wanting some more. It's a fascinating space. It's a great way. It's why when I saw it, I thought, okay, you don't often see articles like this, not just sort of over on certain platforms as well. And it's a great list of references here as well, Chris. So it's an important body of work. It certainly fits within our domain of critical technology, and then also in that defence and space. So it covers all aspects, cyber as well as cities and infrastructure. So lasers is one of those central pieces of technology that often gets forgotten until it's too late anyway. But we have obviously seen that disruption at cities, protests, and we're also seeing the deployment in a military context. So it's a very, very interesting subject. So look, we'll leave it there. Let me get back to the title again so I say it correctly. The War Laser, New Terrestrial Surface Battlefield Geometry. We've been joined by Dr. Chris Flaherty here in Sydney, and the paper itself will be available on the show notes. Chris, thank you so much for your time, yeah, look forward to catching up when we're able to meet. Appreciate it.
Certainly look forward to that.
Good on you.
Chris. Bye.
Good on you, and thank you very much for joining us on MySecurityTV, and check out our live episodes, and obviously these sort of special recorded episodes also. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.